Hey everybody, it's PartyElite, and today we're taking a look at some brand new footage from Total War Warhammer 3. Showcasing a battle between the forces of Tzeentch and Cathay, the battle trailer is a great bit of storytelling and it's chock full of information. Keep in mind that while the footage is captured in-game, it isn't necessarily representative of how things might actually flow or play, of course, so take it all with a grain of salt. Visuals aside though, our excellent narrator is back with details for us to pore over, and though there is room for some speculation, some things are clear as day. The trailer is about 10 minutes long, so feel free to use the timestamps below to navigate around it and any of these sections in today's video, and if you're enjoying all this Total War coverage on the channel, don't hesitate to let me know below with a like and a comment. With that said, let's begin.
The Great Bastion, more than a wall, a symbol of everlasting defiance, is besieged. Demon armies in service to Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, have amassed at the Snake Gate, the Turtle Gate, and the Dragon Gate. A three-pronged attack to overwhelm the wall and corrupt the lands of Cathay beyond. Miao Ying, the Storm Dragon, defender of the northern provinces, master of the storm winds, and supreme matriarch of Nangao, rides with her army to once again drive back the Chaos God's advances. The Snake Gate, one of three heavily fortified gateways bridging Grand Cathay and the Chaos Wastes. A fortress built into the Great Bastion itself and a key defensible position for Miao Ying. Seldom do the demons breach it, but when they do, Grand Cathay is plunged into suffering. If chaos is not stopped here, it's the lands beyond that will suffer. Best to face these demons head-on in a fortress built for defense, than to allow them to encircle and besiege any one of Cathay's majestic cities. Should the unthinkable happen, Cathay is not indefensible. Chaos will find every inch of every street hard fought and shielded every step of the way. The Dragon Emperor would expect no less from his loyal subjects. Miao Ying is the firstborn of the Celestial Dragon Emperor and commander of the Great Bastion. She is the Storm Dragon, and expertly wields the Lore of Yin to both smite her foes and grant boons to her soldiers. Grand Cathay at its core approaches war defensively. Centuries spent beating back the endless waves of chaos has taught them to covet the delicate balance between soldiers and the unparalleled strength of magic and black powder. Unbreakable lines of spear and swordsmen to hold back the hordes, whilst archers, crossbowmen, wizards, artillery, and war machines decimate from afar. This is yin and yang, the harmony between Cathay's combatants, giving heart and order in the face of horrors untold. So in tune with the winds of magic are Cathay's wizard kind, that the mere presence of another user bolsters magical potency. This elemental mastery rings true for 2 wizards as it does for 10, making Cathay's magical prowess a thing of deadly wonderment, which they'll need in earnest to survive the coming storm. Kairos Fateweaver is the insidious architect of this assault, and is heralded as the wisest of the Lords of Change. Cast into the Well of Eternity by Tzeentch, Fateweaver emerged with 2 heads. The left scries the past, while the right foresees the future. Thus, the Oracle of Tzeentch sees both the road ahead and the path behind, but is rendered blind to the present. The demons of Tzeentch march forward, their legions unfathomable as they shake the very ground with their approach. Fateweaver relies on a powerful array of ranged and flying lesser demons to chip away at and harass the Great Bastion, whilst hammering it with horrifying spells from afar. But given the fortress walls to hunker behind, Cathay has the rare advantage in a toe-to-toe ranged standoff this day. To counter, Fateweaver deploys a host of melee demons to soak up the limited pool of Miao Ying's ammunition. To aid in their approach, these foul demons possess a shield of magical energy that Cathay's desperate defenders must first shatter before the creature beneath can be wounded. The drums of war thunder, and the invasion begins. The approach is tough for Fateweaver, whose forces are hammered by Cathay's great cannons and fire rain rockets. These deadly artillery units can devastate an approaching army, demolishing the morale of even the most hardiest of men. But demons don't possess such mortal weaknesses, and it's the peasant archers and the Jade Warrior crossbowmen who must chip away at the endless hordes approaching. Nearby Celestial Dragon Guard and Jade Warriors create a harmonious battlefield for their ranged allies, making these warriors of Cathay fight all the harder in the name of their Dragon Emperor. But it's not enough. Miao Ying, sensing the impending fall of the outer wall, lends her magic and abilities to the fray. She casts Talons of Night to cover the retreat of her archers and crossbowmen, and Wrath of the Storm to bolster the might of her readying Jade Warriors. Meanwhile, Kairos Fateweaver instructs his minions to bring down the fortress gates. To ensure his own survival, he selfishly casts Oracle of Eternity to reinforce his resistance, and Gaze of Fate to counter Miao Ying's boost to her Jade Warrior's effectiveness. The fortress is breached, and Tzeentch can almost taste Cathay beyond the Bastion. But Miao Ying isn't done yet. She falls back, retreating to her barricades, where already crossbowmen and archers are docked to cover the exodus. Kairos' foresight makes him a hard beast to outmaneuver, and he didn't take the western path as Miao Ying had hoped he would. She orders her barricades to be deconstructed and rebuilt in the east of the fortress, where the demons are making strong headway. From here, Miao Ying knows she's entering a war of attrition. She's dedicated key hardpoints to fall back to, and can now only hope she has the manpower to defeat Fateweaver's forces before her own are overwhelmed. It's an arduous and bitter battle, and forces Miao Ying all the way back to her last line of defense. Here is where the battle is won, or the Bastion falls. Fateweaver's forces are dwindled but not defeated, and Miao Ying has only a fraction of the brave men and women she began with. With little other choice, she calls upon her greatest of powers and transforms into her namesake, assuming her dragon form. In the face of such raw power, Kairos Fateweaver and his legion of demons are overwhelmed and routed. The Changer of Ways' blindness to the present has lost him the battle. But surely he knew this defeat would come to pass. Snake Gate stands firm, and Miao Ying the Storm Dragon, defender of the northern provinces, master of the storm winds, and supreme matriarch of Nangao, emerges victorious. But an unease settles within her gut. Tzeentch is the architect of fate, the Changer of Ways, and such an all-out assault is not indicative of his servants. Though the Snake Gate was a victory, Miao Ying cannot shake the feeling that the day's events have heralded a changing of the tide. Fresh threats are awakening, and the fall of the Turtle Gate shows that the Great Bastion's resilience may not be as certain as once thought.
The Gates of the Great Bastion. As more and more is revealed about Cathay and the Great Bastion specifically, the more it feels like they'll be handled similar to the gate battles on Ulthuan. That's neither good nor bad, it just sets a baseline for us to draw assumptions from. The gate battles were a pretty solid addition to Game 2, so it only makes sense we see an implementation and perhaps an evolution of the concept moving forward, but let's see exactly what it entails here. We know that there are at least 3 gates along the length of the Bastion: the Snake Gate, the Turtle Gate, and the Dragon Gate. Later on, the narration seems to confirm that there are actually exactly 3 gates, and we're at the Snake Gate here. The narration goes on to say that this gate isn't often breached, but when it is, it causes, well, chaos in the realm of Cathay. Naturally, if you're the player attacking these gates, it's not going to be an impossible ordeal, and with the right army and the right tactics, you should be able to see victory. But if you're playing as Cathay, I'd be surprised if your engagements with Tzeentch only ever take place at the walls. That would get real repetitive real fast. I imagine there are a few ways this can be avoided. One way would be to have the campaign start with Tzeentch having breached through one of the gates already. At the end of this footage, in fact, there is mention of the Turtle Gate having fallen, and this means that Cathay needs to beat back this offensive quickly before the corruption sets in. I wouldn't be surprised if the opening map overview for the Cathay playthrough begins with this being a crucial point to focus on, that yes, Tzeentch has made it over the Great Bastion and you need to beat back this offensive. Alternatively, it's only a matter of time before the Tzeentch factions gain access to their teleportation stance. Supposedly, that allows them to teleport through impassable terrain, and while the Great Bastion might have wards to prevent this kind of thing from happening, surely the literal god that is Tzeentch can overcome it in some way. Maybe there's a right or ability to do something like this? And finally, failing the first 2 options, there's always the matter of corruption. I wouldn't be surprised if Tzeentch corruption is nearby or has already set in some of these cities, considering that Tzeentch cults have historically been a part of Cathay lore, and if that's to be represented, having Tzeentch corruption at a high amount in certain pockets along the Great Bastion would be one way to do so. This means that any corruption-related spawning or rebellions that occur would be, I suspect, Tzeentchian in nature, giving Tzeentch a clever way past the giant wall, and this kind of clever move fits the bill. There's a bird pun that none of us were expecting. Now, I will say, it does sound like, yes, the Turtle Gate has fallen, and that will be Tzeentch's entry into the land of Cathay, but that does sound like it might be too easy for the player to overcome when playing as Cathay, so I'm curious just how souped up the Turtle Gate might be defending as Tzeentch. Does it get burned down? Does Tzeentch have more than just the Turtle Gate? Does he have a bunch of armies already past the Great Bastion? All this stuff is going to be very interesting to see because, like I said, if Tzeentch is stuck at the wall and your only engagement with him is at the wall, it could get a little repetitive. So again, I think the Turtle Gate having fallen is a clear indication of Creative Assembly noting that and wanting to make sure that Tzeentch has a bit of an advantage in that storyline, but we'll see in due time. Either way, I think it's safe to assume that these gates come with pre-existing garrisons, and I suspect they'll be pretty souped up compared to your regular garrison, and I also suspect that you'll be able to upgrade or otherwise invest in the gates to bolster their garrison, strengthen their towers, and perhaps add more terracotta sculptures to bring into battle. The question is, will Chaos factions be able to hold these gates as well? Or will they simply destroy them as they march through? It would be a shame if only Cathay can hold on to these gate cities, let's call them, or fortresses perhaps. I imagine other factions can as well, and I'm curious how that transition of control is put on display. For example, of course, if Kislev takes over some of these gates, do we get some Kislevite theming? What happens down the line when we get DLC factions and hypothetically, Nippon comes through under whatever name they've been given for their rebrand? What if they capture some of these gate fortresses? What about when the Empire or the Dark Elves or whoever else gets integrated into the game? What happens when they take over these fortresses? I'm very curious, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Toggle fly confirmed. On the topic of getting ahead of myself, I'm going to do it again for a quick minute over here. I don't want to assume that this is a feature when they haven't outright confirmed it, but at this point, we've seen more than one instance that suggests toggling fly mode is in the game. Not only does Kairos take off right at the start of his own trailer, but we see it in this trailer, and before that, we see the Lord of Change in the air, while later in the trailer, we see the Lord of Change marching on foot. It'd be one thing if we only saw them fighting on foot as we do later, like engaged in battle, but to see them marching on foot? Come on, right? They must be able to toggle flying. I really hope this is the case because it adds such a great extra layer to the battlefield. It makes me think of the War Game series, funnily enough, telling choppers to either stay low or fly high for the various buffs and debuffs and risks and rewards that it would provide. It just feels like that little extra bit of added tactical depth where you have to balance the advantage of ignoring terrain penalties and moving faster at the risk of being more easy to shoot down. Against something like Cathay with its sniper rifle crane guns and its archers and crossbows to boot, you're probably taking quite a risk, but if you can fly over their walls and harass their gun lines, it might well be worth it. This is all shot in-game, and though it might be stitching together multiple takes of the battle to get the optimal results for each shot to tell the story, we're clearly seeing an in-game unit go from grounded to airborne here. Once right on screen, and again off-screen-ish. If this isn't confirmation, I don't know what is. There's some pretty cheeky stuff though, since we technically can't say for sure, so well played, CA. Well played. Miao Ying details. Since Miao Ying leads the defense and is in fact the ruler of the northern provinces, it only makes sense we learn more about her today too. Early on in the trailer, there's mention of her riding with her army. I imagine this is just a figure of speech, or maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I wonder if this means that she does have some mount options. The roster reveal doesn't suggest as much, and it's a little funny to think about somebody who can transform into a literal dragon traveling on horseback, but there surely must be some drawbacks to being in dragon form, and you still need to get from place to place. I'm talking purely sort of in-universe, right? Does she transform into a dragon every time she has to close great distances? Or does she kind of get carried around in a palanquin or like by pallbearers or something? Anyway, I'm getting distracted by world-building conversations. I'm sure it's just a throwaway turn of phrase and I'm reading too much into it. As the trailer continues though, we do see her marching on foot and we see her floating as well. It's possible that one is a walking animation and the other is a running animation, but I wouldn't be surprised if she's always floating and has maybe the Strider trait when in her human form. She has access to the Lore of Life and the Lore of Yin, which we'll talk about a bit more in just a little bit, and naturally, as mentioned many times before, she's able to transform into a dragon form, which, from the sound of things, causes fear and terror. I'd expect as much. I do want to say that I much prefer Miao Ying's transformation animation than the pop-in we got for Malice. This feels a lot more intentional and magical. Swapping meshes is a challenging thing to make look good, and morphing between two such vastly different looking meshes isn't easy either. In fact, that's technically very intense and probably impossible to do in real time without having everyone's computers catch fire. It's always going to have to be a swap between two different models, and I think this is a clean way to do it. Still no clear indication of the drawbacks of transforming though as far as game mechanics are concerned, but we do see her transform back and forth a couple of times in this footage. Now again, I feel like it bears repeating, this isn't necessarily gameplay footage as much as it's shot in-game, so while the visuals all are what we're likely to see in the game itself, we shouldn't put too much weight into liberties being taken for the purpose of good storytelling. With that said, since they are so powerful, I wouldn't be surprised if the transformation isn't maybe something that lasts only 120 seconds and then has like a 300-second cooldown or something before it can be used again. It's either that or the two forms favor two completely different sets of situations, and you'll want to switch back and forth accordingly, though a long cooldown timer would mean it's a major decision each time. I suspect, for example, Miao Ying on foot doesn't cause fear and terror, but she's a lot harder to focus down with ranged fire. Differences like this can be both logical in-universe and can also encourage the use of both forms without feeling too ham-fisted. I'm curious about her disdain of dragons trait. I wonder if it only applies in dragon form or if it applies in both forms. The way it was phrased in the roster reveal, it makes it sound like dragons have a bit of an attitude problem and just hate non-dragons, giving them a buff to damage output perhaps. It makes me think of the hatred feat from D&D, which grants a character bonuses against a specific race that it particularly hates. But Miao Ying hates everyone. On the topic of the roster reveal though, the Cathay vs. Tzeentch matchup and unit details. We've seen the Cathay roster and all the variety it has. This trailer doubles down on the messaging, making it clear that there's something for every layer of deployment when it comes to Cathay. Infantry, archers, crossbows, artillery, and war machines. We've seen the Wuxing War Compass as well, a magic artillery piece, and a couple of times throughout this trailer, we hear talk of Harmony, and while we've been given some details about how Harmony works, like increasing the fire rate of fire rain rockets when placed next to an infantry unit, we've not been given crystal clear explanations across the board. All we know is that Yin units and Yang units work together, presumably always through proximity, to provide some type of buff or another. I assume at times it'll be things like higher firing rates, and at other times it might bolster melee attack or defense stats or weapon strength perhaps. With that said though, on the other side of the battlefield, we haven't had a full roster reveal for Tzeentch yet, though I'm fairly sure we've seen almost all there is to see. Kairos is set to rely on ranged and flying lesser demons, and the narration makes note of how Cathay has the rare ranged advantage in this matchup. That seems wild to me because compared to all the guns and artillery and war machines of Cathay, Tzeentch hasn't looked particularly strong by comparison from range. Maybe these pink and blue horrors pack much more of a punch from range than I'd originally anticipated, and seeing this shot suggests that, yeah, that's probably the case, and my god, it makes me all the more excited to play as Tzeentch. Listen, I was already pumped to play as Tzeentch, okay? I'm super excited, and this kind of stuff gets me even more excited, so I'm doubling down. Tzeentch is probably going to be my first playthrough. Now, here it also looks like the Soul Grinder of Tzeentch uses magic in combat. I'd say he's still engaged in melee, but his animations include a magical flair to them, implying magical damage output. There is one instance where I think we're seeing a bound ability being used, and this almost definitely causes magical damage. The narrator also makes mention of Cathay's limited ammunition. Now, does this mean that their gunners in particular are perhaps not carrying all that much ammo? It's a good way to force variety as opposed to missile spam, but again, I feel like it's just a throwaway line, some, flavor for the story that's being told here. Apart from that though, not only do we get a really cool idle animation for Kairos, now if you look behind that, it does look like the Flamers are single entity units, while previously they've looked like multi-entity units. So this was actually a bit of a surprise to me. I thought they might come in like small groups of 5 or 6 or 8 or something like that, but here it does look like they're individual entities as individual units. I also want to correct something that I'd said in a previous video. From the sounds of it, the Lord of Change here is just a generic Lord of Change, and there will be an exalted Lord of Change as well, but there's no sartorial to be seen here, at least not yet. We catch this Lord of Change casting a breath spell later in battle, and we also see the Herald of Tzeentch, I assume, firing down a magic missile too. Further down the line, after Miao Ying transforms into her dragon form, we see the pink horrors explode, but again, we don't see any blue horrors spawn out of them as they explode. Presumably, based on the setup over here, their morale has been overwhelmed and they've been banished. Again, much like undead crumble and disintegrate, demons take similar types of damage when morale drops, so they don't actually break and run away from combat, they just start to take damage. Now again, it's possible that pink horrors exploding into blue horrors is just not in the game, or it's possible that it only happens when morale is above a certain threshold, preventing, battle being prolonged when everyone's being banished, basically. Now, I do assume, again, that this dragon form causes fear and terror, but I also wouldn't expect literal demons to be affected by such things. Unless, I guess, lesser demons are called lesser for a reason. But again, I expect they have a resistance to fear and terror, and again, this is just a bit of storytelling going on. Magic and bound abilities in Cathay. Magic for Cathay is an interesting beast. We know they have the Lore of Yin and Yang, and we've also heard of them wielding the Lore of Life, the Lore of Heavens, and the Lore of Metal between Miao Ying, Zhao Ming, astromancers, and alchemists. Alchemists will have access to potions that can be used on themselves and on allied units as well, and I'm not sure if these will be items like health, speed, strength potions, and things like that, or if they'll be multi-use bound abilities with cooldown timers instead. But I think it's safe to say that they'll largely be buffs and maybe like health regeneration rather than anything offensive instead. We see the alchemist cast Searing Doom, I'm fairly certain, close to the end or so of the battle, and we also already know the names of the spells of the Lore of Yin and Yang, but this video is the first time we see them in action, certain of some of their names. Talons of the Night looks like Dwellers Below. Focus on an area, cause direct damage, and maybe a bit of a slowdown. An overcast version might result in a longer duration. And it is a beautiful looking spell. I absolutely love, oh my god, it's beautiful. The Lore of Yin has a few more spells that sound interesting in name, though I don't think we see them in action here. Storm of Shadows sounds like it might be a bombardment spell maybe. Cloak of Jet might grant units the hidden state, allowing them to stalk around and, sort of sneak around and get behind the enemy and things like that. Missile Mirror we've seen in action before in a separate trailer, but I am curious still about exactly how it works. Is it a prolonged spell that lasts until a certain amount of time, or until maybe it's been worn down? Does it have like an HP bar of its own? Or is it something that you have to time the casting of and a bit more micro-intensive? Either way, Blossom Wind sounds like it might be a wind spell, or it might be a buff for friendly units. Ancestral Warriors, meanwhile, helps raise ghosts of the dead to fight. It's yet to be seen or hinted at exactly what form these spirits take, but they'll be around, I assume, for a limited time because they're summons, and I suppose they might be like Cairn Wraiths or Banshees in terms of the ghostly elements there, but what kind of weapons do they wield? What kind of role do they play? Surely any ancestors worth raising like this are more valuable than a clan rat or a zombie or a skeleton, right? The Lore of Yang, meanwhile, comes with Jade Shield, which might be something we're seeing in action here, even though we don't see a Lore of Yang caster anywhere else. The only reason I say this is because we have these little jade-colored icons floating over people's heads. I assume Jade Shield is an armor buff or an increase to physical resistance, or perhaps a ward save entirely. Either way, it's a defensive buff, and I imagine it targets one unit, but when overcast, targets an area instead, and gives larger numerical buffs. It's possible that the Alchemist has access to Jade Shield either as a spell or maybe as a potion, but again, that's a lot of speculation going on. We just know that there is a spell over here being used that includes jade icons hovering over people's heads, and my sort of educated guess is that maybe this is Jade Shield over here. Apart from Jade Shield, though, there is Dragon's Breath, which we don't see, but I assume to be a breath spell that causes fire damage. There's also Wall of Wind and Fire, which I assume to be a wind spell. Stone Ground Stance, which I assume to give melee defense buffs. Might of Heaven and Earth, which I assume to be a buff to weapon strength and armor, or perhaps just melee defense and attack stats. And then there's Constellation of the Dragon, which I think might be a bombardment spell. Apart from spells, we're given insight into one more bound ability in Wrath of the Storm from Miao Ying. At least I assume it's a bound ability, since it's neither under Yin nor Yang. It's described to bolster the might of her readying warriors, so one would assume it to be a buff to melee stats. Since it's called Wrath of the Storm, implying aggression, I imagine it's about weapon strength and melee attack, perhaps. Primarily, at least. All speculation, of course, again, but I feel like these guesses aren't too far off the mark. I'd be curious to read your theories about the spells and bound abilities we're seeing in this footage, so feel free to share down below. But before we wrap up the talk of Cathay and their magic, it's important to note that the presence of multiple casters on the battlefield is set to bolster the potency of spells. It's also implied that this effect stacks. Now, I'm curious exactly what kind of bolstering we're seeing here. The implication of the soundbite isn't a bolstering of the Winds of Magic or the recharge rate, no, but the spells themselves, their efficiency, their damage output, their numbers. I'm curious. Now, naturally, you'll want to balance how many casters you have while still retaining an actual, army, but I worry about the AI with its ridiculous character-heavy armies taking advantage of this incentive. Time will tell, of course, but it's an interesting concept, and one I'd also expect to see from the other side of the battlefield. On which note, magic and bound abilities for Tzeentch. While we get the names of a couple of spells on the Tzeentch side of things, there are quite a few more on display than that. Right at the start we see a magic missile, and the claim is that it's doing damage to the walls, but I can't imagine that's really what's going on here. This looks more like it's targeting the units on the walls perhaps, or the flying war machines instead, which is more of what I'd expect. Now this looks like a bombardment spell, and we see it from farther out for a split second later on. It seems like an extremely large radius, and one can assume it has more missiles within that same radius when overcast. Either that or the expanded radius is the result of an overcast in the first place, so we'll see exactly what comes of it, but this bombardment spell is almost certainly a spell in the lores that Tzeentch has access to. Now later on we hear mention of the Oracle of Eternity. If I'm not mistaken, this is a Kairos-specific ability that lets him influence dice rolls on tabletop, so I'm assuming that this is a bound ability here instead, and since there's no dice, it obviously works slightly differently in this game, where, as the narrator says, it regenerates the barrier that protects Tzeentch units. I assume this is an ability or spell that can be targeted. It doesn't automatically activate on the caster, but can be used on allied units as well, and that's why the narration here describes its use as selfish, because it's been cast on himself, or so I think at least. Gaze of Fate looks like a really cool spell. I love the way, for just like a split second there, the iris kind of like contracts. You can see the eye like flutter about. It's so cool to look at. Now the spell itself seems to be along the lines of a net. Anytime I see this kind of animation, I assume it's a net that either holds the target completely in place or otherwise greatly slows it down. I can see an overcast either lasting longer or hitting an area rather than a specific unit, or of course, both. This kind of battlefield control has always been interesting to watch. Pinning a lord or high-value target in place, especially as a ranged heavy faction, has a huge benefit. It can also help prevent the escape of a damaged unit that might seek the Lore of Life to recuperate. Now here we see a magic missile being cast by the Herald of Tzeentch from atop a burning chariot, and later on, we see maybe the overcast version of that same spell being cast with more missiles coming through. Again, sometimes overcast magic missiles have more missile count, right? So might be a representation of that. Finally, we see an augment spell get dropped on Kairos on his way out. I don't think it ever gets executed because we don't see any visuals that suggest as much, but we know now that there is an augment spell out there for one of the lores that Tzeentch has access to. It's also instead possible that it's a bound ability being triggered, but one way or another, there's an augment here, we just don't know or see what it does. This battle was chock full of all sorts of information, and the narration and camera work was solid. Some of my favorite, actually. Like, in terms of in-game camera work, some of my favorite. A lot of those whip pans were beautiful. A lot of the, like, easing in and out was just magnificent. Honestly, I like it. I like it a lot. And when the narration first happened in the previous video, or I guess 2 videos ago now, some of you were like, it's okay. It's grown on me. Honestly, I love the hammed up dramatic narration. It really feels right. I'm enjoying it thoroughly. I'm a little concerned about some of the frame rate drops we're seeing, but again, this is still early days. The game might be 6 months away, so they're probably still optimizing stuff. It looks like too many explosions makes the game just chug right now, which is a bit worrying for battles with this many, visual effects going on. But again, like I said, they're probably still optimizing this stuff. They're probably still figuring it out, and hopefully they do, because it would be a shame if we see these kinds of frame rate drops when you consider Cathay is going to have all sorts of missiles, Tzeentch is going to have all sorts of missiles. I'm sure we're going to see similar stuff from Slaanesh and Nurgle as well, perhaps. It's going to be a VFX-heavy game, so I really hope they're able to figure this out. All in all, though, there was a lot to chew on here, and I hope you guys enjoyed this deep dive into the new battle footage. If you did, let me know down below with a like and a comment, and your own thoughts as well. I'm always curious to hear what other people think. As always, for more Total War and strategy gaming content, don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel. And also, as always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big old thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.